Hey guys, it is me, Dom. I am here with a weekly poet. This week we are going to go ahead and touch base on someone that I'm sure everyone knows, and I believe I've recited a poem from him before, but I really want to dig in and do a couple more because why not? So the poet and author that I'm going to be talking about today is going to be Edgar Allan Poe. Ooh. So it's funny because I was having dinner last night with my family, and one of my family members is taking Italian classes to learn the language and everything. Long story short, the guy that's mentoring her just opened a bookstore, and we happened to find just a couple things based off of Edgar Allan Poe. So we were talking about him, and it reminded me of when I was first introduced to him a little bit in middle school, but in high school is when I really dug deep because of an amazing English teacher of mine. So yeah, I thought it'd be fun to kind of be reminiscent and just talk about Edgar Allan Poe. So as we know, he is from the 19th century, so 1809 to 1849, way back when a lot of things were different. But yeah, so let me go ahead and read just a little bit about him as an individual, and then I'll go ahead and go into a poem. Edgar Allan Poe's stature as a major figure in world literature is primarily based on the indigenous and profound short stories, poems, and critical theories, which established a highly influential rationale for the short form in both poetry and fiction. Regarded in literacy, histories, and handbooks as the architect of the modern short story, Poe was also the principal forerunner of the art for art's sake movement in 19th century European literature. Whereas earlier critics predominantly concerned themselves with moral or ideological generalities, Poe focused his criticism on the specifics of style and construction that contributed to a work's effectiveness or failure in his own work. He demonstrated a brilliant command of language and technique as well as an inspired and original imagination. Poe's poetry and short stories greatly influenced the French symbolists of the late 19th century, who in turn altered in the direction of modern literature. Poe's father and mother were professional actors. At the time of his birth in 1809, they were members of a repertory company in Boston. Before Poe was 3 years old, both of his parents died, and he was raised in the home of John Allan, a prosperous explorer from Richmond, Virginia, who never legally adopted his foster son. As a boy, Poe attended the best schools available. He was admitted to the University of Virginia at Charlottesville in 1825. While there, he distinguished himself academically, but was forced to leave after less than a year because of bad debts and inadequate financial support from Allan. Poe's relationship with Allan disintegrated upon his return to Richmond in 1827, and soon after Poe left for Boston, where he enlisted in the army and also published his first poetry collection, Tamerlane and Other Poems. The volume went unannounced by readers and reviewers, and a second collection, All Araf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, received only slightly more attention when it appeared in 1829. The same year, Poe was honorably discharged from the army, having attained the rank of a regimental sergeant major, and was then admitted to the United States Military Academy at West Point. However, because Allan would neither provide his foster son with sufficient funds to maintain himself as a cadet nor give the consent necessary to resign from the academy, Poe gained a dismissal by ignoring his duties and violating regulations. He subsequently went to New York City, where Poems, his third collection of verse, was published in 1831, and then to Baltimore, where he lived at the home of his aunt, Miss Maria Clem. Over the next few years, Poe's first short stories appeared in the Philadelphia Saturday Courier, and his MS Found in a Bottle won a cash prize for best story in the Baltimore Saturday Visitor. Nevertheless, Poe was still not earning enough to live independently, nor did Allan's death in 1834 provide him with an inheritance. The following year, however, his financial problems were temporarily alleviated when he accepted an editorship at the Southern Literacy Messenger in Richmond, bringing him with his aunt and his 12-year-old cousin Virginia, whom he married in 1836. Did I read that right? Anyways, the Southern Literacy Messenger was the first of several journals Poe would direct over the next 10 years and through which he rose to prominence as a leading man of letters in America. Poe made himself known not only as a superlative author of poetry and fiction, but also as a literacy critic whose level of imagination and insight had hitherto been unapproached in American literature. While Poe's writings gained attention in the late 1830s and early 1840s, the profits from his work remained meager, and he supported himself by editing Burton's Gentleman's Magazine and Graham's Magazine in Philadelphia and the Broadway Journal in New York City. After his wife's death from tuberculosis in 1847, Poe became involved in a number of romantic affairs. It was while he prepared for his second marriage that Poe, for reasons unknown, arrived in Baltimore in late September of 1849. On October 3rd, he was discovered in the state of semi-conscious. He died 4 days later without regaining the necessary lucidity to explain what had happened during the last days of his life. Poe's most conspicuous contribution to world literature derives from the analytical method he practiced both as a creative author and as a critic of the works of his contemporaries. His self-declared intention was to formulate strictly artistic ideals in a milieu that he thought overly concerned with the utilitarian value of literature, a tendency he termed the heresy of the didactic. While Poe's position includes the chief requisites of pure aestheticism, his emphasis on literacy for formalism was directly linked to his philosophical ideals. Though he calculated use of language, one of many express, though always imperfectly, a vision of truth and the essential condition of human experience, Poe's theory of literacy creation is noted for two central points. First, a work must create a unity of effect on the reader to be considered successful. Second, the production of this single effect should not be left to the hazards of accident or inspiration, but should to the minuest detail of style and subject to be result of rational deliberation on the part of the author. Very interesting guy. I mean, he's famous for a reason, right? In poetry, this single effect must arouse the reader's sense of beauty, an ideal that Poe closely associated with sadness, strangeness, and loss. In prose, the effect should be one revelatory of some truth, as in tales of rationation, or works evoking terror or passion or horror. Aside from a common theoretical basis, there is a psychological intensity that is the characteristic of Poe's writings, especially the tales of horror that comprise his best and best-known works. These stories, which include The Black Cat, The Cask of Amontillado, I think that was the first one I read from him, and The Telltale Heart, are often told by a first-person narrator, and through his voice, Poe probes the workings of a character's psyche. This technique foreshadows the psychological explorations of Fyodor Dostoevsky and the school of psychological realism. In his Gothic tales, Poe also employed an essentially symbolic, almost allegorical method which gives such works as The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of the Red Death, and Ligeia, enigmatic quality that accounts for their enduring interest and links them with the symbolic works of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. The influence of Poe's tales may be seen in the work of later writers, including Ambrose Bierce, and H.P. Lovecraft, who belonged to a distinct tradition of horror literature initiated by Poe. In addition to his achievement as creator of the modern horror tale, Poe is also credited with parenting two other popular genres, scientific fiction and detective story, in such works as The Unparalleled Adventure of Hans Pfaall and von Kepler and His Discovery. Poe took advantage of the fascination for science and technology that emerged in the early 19th century to produce speculative and fantastic narratives which anticipate a type of literature that did not become widely practiced until the 20th century. Similarly, Poe's three tales of rationation, the murders in the Rue Morgue, the Purloined Letter, and the Mystery of Marie Roget, are recognized as the models which establish the major characters and literacy conventions of detective fiction. Specifically, the amateur sleuth who solves as a crime that has confounded authorities and whose fears of deductive reasoning are documented by an admiring associate. Just as Poe influenced many succeeding authors and is regarded as an ancestor of such major literacy movements as symbolism and surrealism, he also influenced by earlier literacy figures and movements. In his use of the demonic and the grotesque, Poe evidenced the impact of the stories of E.T.A. Hoffmann and the Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe. While the despair and melancholy in much of his writings reflects the affinity with the Romantic movement of the 19th century, it was Poe's particular genius that in his works he gave consummate artistic form both to his personal obsessions and those previous literacy generations, at the same time creating new forms which provided a means of expression for future artists. We're almost done, guys. I promise. Let me see. Here we go. While Poe is most often remembered for his short fiction, his love as a writer was poetry, which he began writing during his adolescence. His early verse reflects the influence of such English romantics as Lord Byron, John Keats, and Percy Bysshe Shelley, yet foreshadows his later poetry, which demonstrates a subjective outlook and surreal mystic vision. Tamerlane and Al-Araf exemplify Poe's evolution from the portrayal of Byronic heroes to the depiction of journeys within his own imagination and subconscious. The former piece, reminiscent of Byron's Childe Harold pilgrimage, recounts the life and adventures of a 14th century Mongol conqueror. The latter poem portrays a dream world where neither God nor evil permanently reside and where absolute beauty can be directly discerned. In other poems, To Helen, Lenore, and The Raven in particular, Poe investigates the loss of ideal beauty and the difficulty of regaining it. These pieces are usually narrated by a young man who laments ultimately death of his beloved. To Helen is a 3-stanza lyric that has been called one of the most beautiful love poems in the English language. I think we're going to read that one. I haven't read it. The subject of the work is a woman who becomes, in the eyes of the narrator, a personification of the classical beauty of ancient Greece and Rome. Lenore presents ways in which the dead are best remembered, either by mourning or celebrating life beyond earthly boundaries. In The Raven, also a classic that I've read, Poe successfully unites his philosophical and aesthetic ideals. In this psychological piece, a young scholar is emotionally tormented by Raven's ominous repetition of nevermore, in answer to his question about the probability of an afterlife with his deceased lover. Charles Baudelaire noted in his introduction to the French edition of The Raven, "It is indeed the poem of the sleeplessness of despair. It lacks nothing, neither the fever of ideas, nor the violence of colors, nor sickly reasoning, nor drivelling terror, nor even the bizarre gaiety of suffering, which makes it more terrible." Poe also wrote poems that were intended to be read aloud. experimenting with combinations of sound and rhythm. He employed such technical devices as repetition, parallelism, internal rhyme, alliteration, and assonance to produce works that are unique in American poetry for their haunting musically quality. In the bells, for example, the repetition of the word bells in various structures accentuates the unique tonality of the different types of bells described in the poem. Wow. While his works were not conspicuously acclaimed during his lifetime, Poe did earn due respect as a gifted fiction writer, poet, and man of letters, and occasionally he achieved a measure of popular success, especially following the appearance of The Raven. After his death, however, the history of his critical reception becomes one dramatically uneven judgments and interpretations. This state of affairs was initiated by Poe's one-time friend and literacy executive R.W. Griswold, who, in a liberious obituary noticed in the New York Tribune, bearing the byline "looped with," attributed the depravity and psychological abbreviations of many of the characters in Poe's fictions to Poe himself. In retrospect, Griswold's vilifications seem ultimately to have elicited as much sympathy as censor with respect to Poe and his work, leading subsequent biographers of the late 19th century to defend, sometimes too devotedly, Poe's name. It was not until 1941 biography by A.H. Quinn that a balanced view was provided of Poe, his work, and the relationship between the author's life and his imagination. Nevertheless, the identification of Poe with the murders of Madame, his works survived and flourished in the 20th century, most prominently in the form of psychoanalytical studies such as those of Marie Bonaparte and Joseph Wood Crutch. Added to the controversy over the sanity or at the best maturity of Poe, Paul Elmer More called him the poet of unripe boys and unsound men, was the question of the values of Poe's work as serious literature. At the forefront of Poe's detractors were such eminent figures as Henry James, Aldous Huxley, T.S. Eliot, who diminished Poe's works as juvenile, vulgar, and artistically debased. In contrast, the same works have been judged to be of the highest literary merit by such writers as Bernard Shaw and William Carlos Williams. Contemplating Poe's erratic reputation among English and American critics is the more stable and generally more elevated opinion of critics elsewhere in the world, particularly in France. Following the extensive translations and commentaries of Charles Baudelaire in the 1850s, Poe's works were received with a peculiar esteem by French writers, most profoundly those associated with the late 19th century movement of symbolism, who admired Poe's transcendent aspirations as a poet. In the 20th century movement of surrealism, which valued Poe's bizarre and apparently unfolded imagination, and such figures as Paul Valéry found Poe's theories and thought an ideal supreme rationalism. In other countries, Poe's works have been enjoyed in similar regard, and numerous studies have been written tracing the influence of the American author on his international literacy scene, especially in Russia, Japan, Scandinavia, and Latin America. Today, Poe is recognized as one of the foremost progenitors of modern literacy, both in its popular forms such as horror and detective fiction, and the more complex and self-conscious forms, which represent the essential artistic manner of the 20th century. In contrast to earlier critics who received the man and his works as one, criticism of the past 25 years have developed a view of Poe as a detached artist who was more concerned with displaying his virtuosity than with expressing his soul, and who maintained an iconic rather than an autobiographical relationship to his writings. While at one time critics, such as Vore Winters, wished to remove Poe from literary history, his works remain integral to any conception of modernism in world literature. Herbert Marshall McLuhan wrote in an essay entitled Edgar Poe's Tradition, while the New England dons primarily turned the pages of Plato and Buddha beside a tea cozy, and while Browning the Tennysonism were creating a parochial fog for the English mind to relax in. Poe never lost contact with the terrible pathos of his time. Covertly with Baudelaire, the long before Conrad and Eliot, he explored the heart of darkness. So the poem that we're going to be reading today is A Dream, of course, by Edgar Allan Poe. I think after reading all of that, I really got a better understanding as to his type of poetry. Growing up, I kind of saw it as more of just very dark and mysterious, and of course, the perspectives was a big thing that I realized and that we kind of talked about when we did read his poems. So let's do this one. It's very short and sweet. In visions of the dark night, I have dreamed of joy departed, but waking dream of life and light hath left me broken-hearted. Ah, what is not a dream by day to him whose eyes are cast on things around him with a ray? Turn back upon the past, the holy dream, that holy dream. While all the world were chiding, hath cheered me as a lovely beam, a lonely spirit guiding. What though that light throws storm that in night, so tremble from afar? What could there be more purely bright in truth's day star? I think it was lovely, a dream. I mean, the way that he talks about light and night and kind of splits it into two different things as far as what a dream can be to each person. Again, it could mean anything. You could dream about anything. That's why it's a dream. It could be real, not real. And the way that he kind of talks about it is, what though that light through storm and night so trembled from afar? What could be more purely bright in the day's star? I feel like, again, it could be taken as something very pure and sweet and beautiful, or it could go down this dark, unrecognizable path. And again, it's very short, very, I don't want to say charming, but I feel like that's the word that comes to my head when I think of Edgar Allan Poe. Not him as an individual, but the way that his poems are written are very charming. And after reading how his poems are meant to be read aloud, I feel like that can, now I feel like when I read his poems, I'm gonna add a little pizzazz to it. But yeah, super cool poem. I am super excited to read more. Again, he's a very popular poet. He's probably the first one that everyone is kind of introduced to growing up, just because of I feel like schools push Edgar Allan Poe. I don't know if they do, but in all the classes I've been in, he was very, popular. So I was introduced to him quite young, and again, he always just stuck with me because of not only the context and kind of the genre that he writes, but how he writes. Growing up, I can't tell if I read a lot or not. It really depends on the individual. Like, I feel like I don't read a lot now, but I talk to someone else and I find that I do. So it's all about perspective. Either way, I'm super excited to dabble more into him and just kind of learn more, because again, I know his very popular works, but again, you always find the juicy stuff when you dig a little deeper. So super excited. I hope y'all have a good rest of your week, and I'm excited to share some more poems later. So bye.